How are you, Publius?
Doing quite well, Mod. How are you?
Things are well here. I wanted to spend today's class to discuss or talk about governance. But before that, we have a question that maybe we can answer first, and that is from Sophocles. And they ask, they posted a question in the bar in your chat, but I'm going to read it out here. Their question is around wells, and they're asking if there are any current examples where the order books aren't used or aren't using constant product functions, but are using arbitrary price functions like what wells is going to do. So in other words, is there a current example of something that uses that today? And I'm going to post a link to their question in the town hall chat just for others to see.
Not to our knowledge.
Okay. Would you say the order books that centralized exchanges use are similar to that, but not on chain?
No, because centralized order books are typically limit order books, where you can place a bid at a certain price or an ask at a certain price and amount. But there's no need, because in a centralized setting, there's no cost to updating orders, and in theory, there's fair ordering of updates to orders. This is why in a high-frequency trading environment, it's a race to get your orders updated in practice. But the concept is that there's no need in a centralized setting to have sophisticated orders that are curves or curves with arbitrary functions. Curves with arbitrary inputs and arbitrary curves at that.
Okay, clear, and thank you for the answer. Okay, so Publius, as I said before, we wanted to spend some time to talk about governance, and maybe at length, governance in general, and then governance within Beanstalk. And maybe we can start with the first question, and that is, what is governance and what is its purpose?
So we'll limit the what is governance answer to governance in the context of a smart contract, or we'll try to keep it generally within that scope. So in general, smart contracts can be mutable or immutable. And if they're mutable, there's a question as to what entity on chain has the power, what entities on chain have the power to upgrade a given contract. And whereas the majority of smart contracts likely need not be mutable, in the case of the money or the issuer of money, which is Beanstalk, it is, for better or worse, necessary that the contract be upgradable and the monetary policy of the system be improved and certain parameters of the system be improved over time. And while that may not always be the case, it's certainly the case at the moment. And so the question then becomes, if you need the ability to upgrade a smart contract, who and how do they have the ability to upgrade the contract? And in practice, smart contract governance, which again, we're keeping the what is governance answer a little bit limited in scope, but smart contract governance is in practice the system of which decisions are made whether or not to upgrade a given smart contract. Now, you can kind of take that and extrapolate that governance in general is some process by which decisions are made, but beyond that, I think it's probably best if we keep the discussion in the scope of smart contracts, what we're talking about, although it may leak out into a more general discussion.
Okay. And Publius, let's talk a little bit more about the immutable and mutable smart contracts. There are examples of immutable protocols or smart contracts, let's say. But we see that most of these, they talk about V2s in the sense, or they have versions. So even though they're immutable, you find them that eventually they want to do some sorts of upgrades, but they can't do that. So then they just transfer the whole protocol into a newer version. Is that any different from it being mutable?
Well, it is in the sense that there may be some off-chain governance process, either at the company level, if there's a company developing the smart contracts, or at a foundation level, or whoever's developing the contracts. There may be some social process through which it is decided to work on, implement, and deploy new contracts. But the concept is that once a smart contract is made immutable, as you were saying, you're sort of forced into deploying new smart contracts, and so the question becomes whether or not it is necessary for a given smart contract to be upgraded, and if it is, then it makes sense to make it, or it likely makes sense to make it mutable. Whereas if you make it immutable, then any decision over upgrading the system has to come, and there must be some governance in the sense that there's some process over which decisions are made, but that wouldn't happen on chain in that instance.
And I guess the other difference is that even if there are newer versions created, the participant doesn't get upgraded automatically. So they will have to actively choose to move to that newer version or not, versus if, it just happens, it happens as long as, however that governance is modeled. Okay, Publius, do you think that maybe before this question, we go back to what do you think is the decision-making process, or what decides for a smart contract or a protocol to be immutable or mutable?
Meaning, what are some of the factors that may go into whether or not you should make a contract mutable or immutable?
Yes.
Well, that's a great question. From a theoretical perspective, it really depends where the network effect in the product or system that is being built exists. And so let's take Beanstalk as an example. Beanstalk is the issuer of beans, and the network effect happens at the currency layer. So every piece of the system, effectively, other than the Beanstalk address, and in particular, the issuance of bean as a currency, can be replaced without a loss of the network effect. So the fundamental question is, does the system that issues beans need to be upgraded? Or in other words, does the mechanism that issues the currency, the place where the network effect lives, is that where does that system require the ability to be upgraded, or can the network effect be maintained without that? So in the case of beans, the value of the beans comes from the system's ability to maintain itself as the most competitive issuer of money, and the inability to upgrade the rules of the system would likely make it such that the Beanstalk would not be able to compete over long periods of time as an issuer of currency. And so in order to maintain the network effect, it's likely that at the Beanstalk layer, there is a need to upgrade the protocol. On the other hand, consider one of the liquidity pools that is deployed where beans trade in. The rules of that liquidity pool in practice need not be upgraded in order for the system as a whole to continue to function. And more particularly to what you were saying earlier, Mod, in order for the rules of the order in the liquidity pool to change for a user, they would actually have to take action because the pool is immutable in order to move to another pool, or in practice change the order that they are a part of. And so from a intended user experience, it also makes sense to have the pools in which liquidity trades be immutable, whereas, again, just to juxtapose it, Beans or Beanstalk, which is the issuer of Beans, the network effect is maintained there, where you don't want when a given rule change is proposed for the whole system to fragment. The division of liquidity into more than one liquidity pool doesn't cause any fragmentation of the network effect, whereas the division of Beanstalk into the issuer of two different monies, Bean 1 and Bean 2, would directly harm the network effect of the system. So that's one way to think about whether or not it makes sense to have mutable or immutable contracts at any given point in the stack.
Okay, and you've raised great points, Publius. My next question is, how practical do you think is it for a mutable, let's say, protocol, for it to one day say that now we're gonna become immutable? And I'm looking here maybe at the the oldest of protocols, like Bitcoin or Ethereum, and we see them constantly being updated. Do you foresee Beanstalk reaching a level where it reaches a point and be like, that's it, this is it, now we're not going to change anymore?
It's unclear. It's certainly unlikely that point is any time in the next couple of years, and beyond that, it's hard to see very far into the future. But it is worth noting that the protocol ossifying, or the rules of the protocol ossifying and becoming less and less likely to change, is an important part of Beans becoming accepted as money. And so whereas it's still very early and Beanstalk is in a true experimentation phase, and therefore it does make sense to change the rules early and often, if you will, in order to try to get the model as close to optimal as possible, it's probably not ideal to continue to iterate at such a high frequency as the system grows. There's more risk in that, but there's also a lot of benefit in continuing to iterate, because again, Beanstalk will have to compete with every other attempt at issuing money, and in order for it to maintain or to be competitive in the long run, it will have to potentially make certain changes. And so having a system of governance in place through which the protocol can continue to be competitive in an environment where even Beanstalk forks with slightly different rules that may create more economic efficiency may be something that the system has to compete with. So it's a real balance between ossification such that Beans can be accepted as money and flexibility such that the protocol can remain really competitive in the long run. And therefore, it's hard to say whether the protocol will ever reach a point where it doesn't need to change ever, but it is likely to reach a point where it doesn't need to change as frequently as it is currently.
Okay. So we spoke a little bit about what is governance and why is governance needed. Before we talk about what I asked, the question is, what is good governance? Publius, can you maybe tell us what are the risks of governance? So now we want to implement governance or have governance in place. What is the risks that may come with that?
Well, not to answer it in a particularly narrow, but we know the dangers of governance firsthand, because Beanstalk's on-chain governance system was exploited in April, and all of the value in the contract was stolen. So the risks of bad governance are catastrophe. And I think that applies at the smart contract level, as well as almost any other level where there's a system in place. Bad governance can lead to real disaster. And even in situations where the governance isn't horrible, but is just subpar, it's likely that systems with bad governance get outcompeted by systems with good governance. So governance is a very important piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so we see or we know that bad governance may be catastrophic, or it is catastrophic, let's say. The next question then, Publius, is what do you think is good governance? And what are the parameters or the things that governance will want to look after or look at and be like, these are the things we want to optimize towards?
Well, I think that you just said a lot of it, Mod, which is that it's a function of what you're trying to optimize towards. And so governance cannot really be defined as good in an absolute sense. It can only be defined with a view towards what the goals of the governance system are. So in the case of Beanstalk, the goal of the governance system is to straddle that dichotomy of ossifying to become money and flexibility to maintain status as the best money. That's what the governance system should be trying to achieve, while maintaining the integrity and safety of the protocol and the assets in the protocol.
Okay. Would you say the ability to take action or the speed to take decisions as well in governance is one of those important factors?
Well, this is one of the fundamental questions related to the practice of governance, meaning in practice, how should this work? How quickly should the system be upgraded or upgradable? And on the one hand, with a system like Beanstalk, where it's a very complex system and it's still very early, such that there continue to be bugs found in the contract, where there's a need to upgrade the contract through eBIPs, through emergency BIPs. It may be necessary to be able to upgrade the contract quickly for a period of time. But on the other hand, when the system moves back to on-chain governance, one potential remedy or extra safeguard that can be put in place, such that if there is another attempt or a successful attempt at manipulating the governance of the system, that there's some sort of time delay between when the BIP passes and when the BIP can actually be executed, or the diamond cut can be called, such that everyone has the opportunity to leave the system before the attack can actually be executed, is one additional layer of defense that could be implemented when the system moves back to on-chain governance, such that there's some need to again, there's a spectrum or a trade-off that needs to be managed by the system in terms of speed to fix problems with slowness, such that people can leave the system and there's an opportunity for people to move with their legs. And it is worth noting that particularly in the early days of Beanstalk, there were some changes that were time sensitive, and those appear to be fewer and far between, such that a time delay becomes more and more realistic.
Okay. And Publius, do you think that good governance is a product of, let's say, the representation of all participants, or sometimes it may be that you can just have a few select people who choose what governance is, and not everyone gets to vote, basically, or not everyone gets a vote in those changes?
Asking some very deep philosophical questions today, Mike. The reality is that the best system of governance it cannot be defined in terms of representation. It has to be defined in terms of the desired outcomes of the system. And from that perspective, if we take Beanstalk again as an example, Beanstalk does not currently allow for pod holders or FERT holders to participate in governance because they are creditors of the system, and the incentives of being a creditor is such that you want to get repaid as fast as possible, independent of the long-term sustainability of the way that the system repays you. Whereas stockholders are incentivized to be deposited in the system for a long period of time, and therefore it's more likely that they are aligned to with sustainable repayment of debt and sustainable growth in the bean supply, and therefore Beanstalk does allow for stockholders to vote. So the concept is that it's not purely a question of representation. It's really a question of representation in the context of incentives of people or of participants in the system, and how they are incentivized in the context of the desired outcomes of the system as it's being designed.
Okay. Publius, let's talk a little bit more about governance within the Beanstalk ecosystem. What do you see the current challenges that Beanstalk is facing or faces in governance?
So Beanstalk has a lot of problems with governance. The most glaring one is that currently it has off-chain governance, which is not permissionless in practice. And the goal of Beanstalk is to be a totally permissionless issuer of money, and therefore not having on-chain governance is a big problem. And there's an argument to be made that, if you're considering the Lindy effect of a system like Beanstalk, the Lindy effect can't even really kick in until the system reverts back to on-chain governance, particularly given that the system has been exploited when it had on-chain governance. So it's like, until that is re-implemented, you really can't start counting days. And it's important to realize that that is that's a major undertaking, and proof of stake governance is something that hasn't been perfectly figured out thus far, and so there's a lot of work to be done along those lines. Now, related to that is the actual DAO voting, independent of how the will of the DAO is executed, on-chain or off-chain. The actual structure of DAO voting and stockholders voting on things, at the moment, at least based on how the past couple of votes have gone, it seems like participation in governance has decreased. And currently, given that the governance system requires a 50% majority of all stock voting for a given BIP, in order to pass, low voter participation can be a problem, in the sense that if the system can't get a 50% majority voting for any changes, it's going to be unable to improve itself. And Beanstalk is not currently, or at least not likely to be currently, in a place where it can sustain itself in perpetuity, or it can maintain itself as a competitive issuer of money in perpetuity with its current rules. And so it's pretty important that the DAO is able to maintain flexibility at this point in time from our perspective. And it seems like one of the problems, again, if you go back to what is the purpose of governance, it seems like one of the problems with the current implementation of Beanstalk governance is that it doesn't really facilitate the protocol to be sufficiently nimble in order to remain competitive as an issuer of money.
All right. I'm going to ask a few ideas on changing, let's say, governance, or how governance is counted. And a lot of this is from the governance channel. There's a discussion by a few of our farmers. Mostly it's by Mr. Mochi. And here are some of these ideas. And as you said, it is not about executing the will, let's say, or the outcome of the vote, but it's about how do you calculate that or get to it. And the first one has to do with delegation, which is, farmers can basically delegate, their stock or voting power for others that can vote for them. And in that case, maybe we can talk about, what happens in that, or what does that mean. The other one is about diluting the voting power. So, the more active you are in voting, the more power you get, basically, or the more weight your vote gets. Inversely, or on the other side, is that if you don't vote, then your voting power gets diluted or wilts. And then lastly, also on how to calculate the quorum itself. So if we have a period where there's a long time or a long period where participants are not voting, then their voting power or the amount of quorum gets out or is taken away from the total vote. What do you think about these ideas, Publius, and what do you see are the advantages or the disadvantages of them?
So delegation seems to be something that, particularly once Stalk is liquid, it'll be impossible to prevent. And so, like any other thing that is impossible to prevent, it's good to embrace it. And so it probably does make sense to support delegation of the ability to vote. And know that that's something that we haven't always been in support of, but realize that in practice, you can't really get around it. And so, probably just have to accept that. The question around dilution, and I think it's related to the quorum thing. So we're going to combine 2 and 3 in the sense that anytime you're affecting how much people's stock is worth when they're voting, it would likely affect the quorum as well as their voting power. So it's really one thing, at least as we understand what you just said. There's a couple noteworthy things. The first is, I think, as Guy pointed out in one of the discussions around this, that there's some sort of attack around proposing lots of BIPs such that people have to vote, and in particular pay to vote. And if they don't, you're gonna, as the attacker, your stock is going to increase in voting power, and that can potentially make it easier to get malicious BIPs passed. So there's some question as to imposing limits on the amount of BIPs that you can, or the amount of change in stock power based on such a system within a reasonable degree, but likely given that type of attack, that type of change to the system is unlikely to be the winning solution. But it's certainly interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure who proposed a solution to that, but their solution was that the dilution only happens on BIPs that pass. So if there's a BIP that reached quorum and it passed, those who didn't vote on that BIP only then get diluted. Does that make sense?
Well, that introduces an interesting game theoretic thing, which is that then once a BIP looks like it's going to pass, it's in the incentive of everyone to vote. And therefore, you're not actually going to, at least in an efficient market, you'd expect everyone to vote once the system hit 50%. And that it's probably not going to change the way people vote then in practice, or it's not going to be able to have an effect in practice. I guess it may be at the margin, like people that are not even going to vote efficiently in that case to preserve their stock, then those people would be diluted. So maybe that does work a little bit, but unclear if that's, I mean, it's unclear if it's worth the complexity, but it does seem like that's a potential marginal improvement to how things could be accounted for. But it's definitely that would work.
Yeah, because I think, and maybe others can correct my numbers here, that around 25% of the overall stock that's around there and that counts, towards quorum, is held by farmers that didn't even mow. So they, not only are they not participating in voting, they're just not active, and 25% is a big number. on a node. And again, I'm not sure about that, so others can correct me. But if I recall correctly, it is a large number. So in effect, that big number would get diluted in this case. Okay. That's it from my side, Publius, or the questions that I had in mind. Do you have any other thoughts on governance in general, or to farmers about on how you think is is a positive way to think about it within Beanstalk or for Beanstalk, and any changes that you think are positive if implemented?
Lots of thoughts, but one thing that came to mind while you were talking is that we've previously discussed, and I think it was part of the original Seraph BIP, in fact, to have grown stock that isn't mown count towards votes. But to this exact point, that would likely make it even harder for BIPs to pass, and therefore it probably doesn't make sense from a policy perspective to have grown stock that isn't mown count for voting. If you want your grown stock to count for a vote, you should probably mow your stock.
Yeah, and as it stands today, grown stock that is not mowed anyways doesn't account in bean distribution. So I agreed with you in the sense of it not counting towards voting as well. Okay, I think we might have lost Publius, so we'll wait a little bit. In the meanwhile, to our audience, if you have any questions or you'd like us, to discuss anything in specific, please feel free to drop it in the town hall chat.
Sorry, Maud, I don't know what happened. I lost.
No problem. I was just saying, if any of our audience had questions, they can drop it in the town hall chat. Otherwise, Publius, if you had more thoughts you wanted to share, please do.
So feel like there's been a slightly higher quality of discourse on the two BIP drafts, and want to just shout out the people that were participating in that. But I feel like there's a lot more that needs to be discussed, and there is I believe a DAO governance call tomorrow at 1 Eastern for an hour or two, and would really encourage everyone that wants to participate in some of that discussion to just come participate. So there's a lot of open questions as to how a proof of stake system can sustain itself in perpetuity without any sort of exposure to a 51% attack, effectively, like Beanstalk did, given that the system requires high levels of liquidity. And so it's likely that along the lines of what we were talking about with the time lock, that in order for a given governance system to ultimately work for Beanstalk, it's really going to have to revolve around choice, where there's some need to opt into the new system, and there's no way to force people into a chain system, if that makes sense. But obviously, to the comment earlier around the network effect of Beanstalk, that the goal is to prevent as much as possible any sort of fragmentation like that. So it's a very interesting thing to think about from a design perspective, how the mechanism should work such that the system can actually protect everyone's ability to leave the system according to the rules that they entered in, with the ability to upgrade itself. So probably a lot to be thought of on that in that regard, and looking forward to having a discussion tomorrow with the DAO.
And to those with us, I've posted a link to the event for tomorrow, so you can also find it in the events at the top of the channels on Discord. Okay. Maybe my last question, Publius, and it goes back a little bit towards the dilution discussion. And I think there are two ways to think about it, and I understand when we said that we can combine both of them. I want to maybe introduce a separation in those, and that is one, those who don't vote, that just changes the quorum. But it doesn't impact their voting power. So the next time they vote, they just get back again, and that's it. And two is that it does dilute your voting power. So even the next time you come and vote, you don't have full capacity or full power again. So I guess the two way to think of it is one, changing the quorum that you reach it, but without taking away your right to vote in the future. And the second one is removing some of that right. I'm only getting it back after, let's say, some set conditions.
Yeah, still think that it's two things that have a very similar effect, which is changing the amount of stock in practice that is needed to pass a given vote, and then it's just a question of whether or not the effect is being implemented such that any given stockholder's voting power is actually decreased, or whether it's just happening at the quorum layer. So there's some slight difference there, but in practice, they have effectively the same implications as we understand it.
Okay. I'm going to pause a little bit more, see if any of our audience have any more questions about governance or something else. Otherwise, we can end this class. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. And Publius, as always, thank you for taking the time for discussion and answering these questions. Once again, I posted a link to tomorrow's governance discussion that's going to take place at 10 a.m. Pacific time or 1 p.m. Eastern. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you next week.